Good morning, and welcome to Reviving the Constitution, the first ever Hillsdale College Town Hall. Live from Chantilly, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., this event is sponsored by Hillsdale's Allan P. Kirby, Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. Established in 2008, the Kirby Center teaches and promotes the principles and practices of American constitutionalism in the nation's capital and throughout the nation. I'm David Bobb, director of the Kirby Center. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome all of you and to lead our first morning's presentation. Today, more than 33,000 people from all 50 states have joined together to consider how we as citizens can revive the Constitution of the United States of America. From Pella, Iowa, to Silicon Valley, California, from Arizona to Ohio, from Washington State to Washington, D.C., citizens are standing up for the Constitution of the United States. Well, maybe not enough yet in Washington, D.C., but thanks to citizen interest, at least, they're starting to hear more about the Constitution in the halls of Congress and throughout the nation's capital. It was an interesting thing, wasn't it, in the August town halls, to see that it was not so much the elected representatives that cited the Constitution first, but rather citizens, like all of you, standing there, holding a document that has meant so much to so many Americans throughout the years. What, then, is the Constitution? The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass asked in 1860. Here I'm quoting from a speech that he gave. It is no vague, indefinite, floating, unsubstantial ideal something, colored according to any man's fancy, now a weasel, now a whale, and now nothing. The American Constitution is a written instrument, full and complete in itself. No court in America, no Congress, no president can add a single word thereto or take a single word therefrom. It is a great national enactment done by the people and can only be altered, amended, or added to by the people. End quote. Frederick Douglass spoke on the campus of Hillsdale College in 1863, just 3 weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect. Our college was founded by abolitionists who, like Douglass, believed that the only path to ending slavery was by standing foursquare on the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. During the Civil War, Hillsdale's campus emptied out as some 500 young men fought for the Union. In fact, from its 1844 founding, Hillsdale has consistently fought especially for three things: equality, liberty, and independence. In its commitment to equality, Hillsdale is the first institution of higher learning founded anywhere in the world with an express commitment to impartially accept all people, men and women, regardless of their color. Hillsdale is similarly committed to liberty, for we believe that a dedication to the liberal arts yields liberty of the highest order. The liberal arts, the ancients knew, and we believe yet today, help to make free individuals. As Hillsdale's founders expressed it in the college's Articles of Association, they were, quote, grateful to God for the inestimable blessings resulting from the prevalence of civil and religious liberty and intelligent piety in the land. Those founders of the college believed that, quote, the diffusion of sound learning is essential to the perpetuity of those blessings. This diffusion of sound learning requires a certain kind of independence. Independence of mind, certainly, but also, as Hillsdale College has discovered, independence from the interference of the federal government. To that end, the college does not accept any aid, direct or indirect, from any financial aid from the federal government. This comes not from an anarchical streak or an aversion to proper accountability, but rather from the knowledge that dependence upon federal taxpayer dollars means subjection to federal rules and regulations that stifle the equality and liberty the college has stood for since its inception. A college that welcomed Frederick Douglass when very few would does not need agents of the federal government dictating its curriculum and culture. Free from any financial bailout from either state or federal sources, Hillsdale College sets its own course. Hillsdale's founders and the founders of the country knew that the teaching and learning of liberty is required of Americans if we are to enjoy the blessings of liberty. Our rights are not self-executing, nor are they guaranteed to endure. They must be defended. That's why we gather here today. Before we begin our first session, in which I'll outline America's foundational principles, I'd like to begin with a few program notes. Throughout today's event, which will include 5 presentations, we'll leave about half the time for conversation about the Constitution. It's a town hall. This conversation will be driven by your questions. For those of you who are watching from home, you'll find directly below the video player a link that you can click on to ask any questions. You may also simply type an email to kirbycenter@hillsdale.edu. That's spelled Kirby center@hillsdale.edu. When you ask a question, either online or in person, we'd ask that you identify yourself by your first name and also tell us where you're from. We got a wonderful note from a gentleman who asked us if this program was also going to be available on DVD. Eddie from Woolwich, Maine, dials in online, but he works 3 jobs, and he said that he wasn't going to have time this morning to join us live. We will make this presentation available for a good long time to come on the same website, and also we'll make it available via DVD. For your questions, we ask that you keep those brief so that we may address as many as possible. Now, if you might just have quick reference to your schedule, I want to make just a quick run-through of what we're going to be covering today, kind of preview of what content we're going to be anticipating throughout the day. This morning, we're going to examine the principles, the rock on which America is founded. And then with Dr. Matt Spalding, who directs the Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and who has a new book out, We Still Hold These Truths. It's a book that goes through systematically and explains what these truths are and why they are still not only relevant, but vital to the preservation of American liberty. Matt is going to talk about the Constitution. What's the plain meaning of that? The plain written meaning. What Frederick Douglass was getting at in that quotation that I started with. Then we'll hear from Dr. Paul Moreno, a constitutional historian at Hillsdale College. Dr. Moreno will speak to questions of the Constitution and the Civil War. What did Abraham Lincoln stand for? What was his role in preserving the Union? We'll then break for lunch. During lunch, those of you who are watching from home will have the treat of seeing a speech that Mark Stein gave. It has the simple title that especially those of you who from the Granite State will recognize, Live Free or Die. Mark Stein was on Hillsdale's campus, gave this talk in, I believe, March of 2009. You'll also watch a video about Hillsdale College that tells you more about the school. After lunch, then, we'll turn to the Progressives' Constitution. You know, it was 100 years ago that the Progressives really came into their full flower. And Dr. R.J. Pistrito, who is a Hillsdale College political scientist, and who just has a new book out that focuses on the writings, the thought of the Progressives. He spent particular time and attention on the thought of Woodrow Wilson, and will address what is progressivism, and what's the legacy of the Progressives today. Then we're really pleased to welcome the president of Hillsdale College, Dr. Larry Arne. He's going to address the question that I'm sure all of you have in mind even now as we speak, and that is, what do we do? What should we do? What can American citizens do to learn, to study, and to know those things that allow us to defend the liberties on which America was founded? That's our day. We look forward to the program. We're going to dive right into our first session. And let me just start by calling attention to some uniquenesses about America. In the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss 3 uniquenesses and 7 principles. The first uniqueness of America is that we have a birthday. Not many nations as old as we do have such a thing. It's impossible to identify the precise beginning of China or the inception of Egypt. We celebrate our nation's birth as Independence Day. We came about as a result of a revolution. Second, then, America is a revolutionary idea. John Adams was asked in 1819 by a gentleman named Hezekiah Niles, with the patriots of 1776, the men who fought in the Revolutionary War, falling daily, disappearing from the American scene, Hezekiah Niles wanted to know, what was the American Revolution really about? John Adams took great care in responding, and he summarized it this way. Quote, "The radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." Now, for those of you who have watched David McCullough's splendid HBO miniseries on John Adams, you know that it was not he that was known so much as being radical. Why did he use that word then? Radical. Well, radical, Adams knew, being a classicist and a man of letters, comes from the Latin word that takes us back to the root. He pushes us back then to the root of things. The radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, of affections of the people was the real American Revolution, Adams says. But it's not radical in the sense that we know that word today. Because the American revolutionaries didn't wish to change human nature. They didn't wish to throw off our religious underpinnings. They didn't even wish to do away altogether at all with our British patrimony. But they did wish to become one independent people, separating themselves from the British. And in so doing, and this is the third uniqueness, our revolution resulted in constitutionalism. Not many revolutions do. Imagine, for an example, a college student unpacking after the summer break, lovingly taking out of their possessions a banner of Che Guevara and putting it on their wall, right? What that commemorates, the revolutions of the 20th century, is something radically different than the revolution that Americans fought and won. Whereas communist revolutions throughout the 20th century sought to transform human nature, the American revolutionaries knew that human nature remains constant throughout the ages. It does not change. That takes us then to the first of our 7 principles. The first principle is human nature. Now, it's kind of a funny place to start, isn't it? Because normally we don't think in our political discourse about human nature a whole lot. But in fact, for the founders, it was the decisive point of departure. As James Madison wrote in The Federalist, which was, after all, a series of op-eds done in New York State, defending, or really arguing, that the Constitution ought to be ratified, that it ought to be approved by the states. Madison wrote this, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? He goes on to discuss the fact that human beings are not angels. At Hillsdale, we have a course on the U.S. Constitution. Every student, all 1,350 students at the college, take that course as part of a core curriculum. That comes on top of courses on the great books in English literature, and also then on 2 semesters worth of history. So the students are understanding and we hope able to articulate then the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. But occasionally, and this has happened I think only twice, there's a funny thing that happens, and that is that phrase that Madison uses. We ask them to write, or at least in my classes I've asked Hillsdale students to write an essay on what it means for men not to be angels. And occasionally we get a variation on that theme, men are not angels. That's a little different story. But men are not angels. What does that mean? It means that we're not perfect, right? We're not perfectible even. Human beings are not perfectible, the founders believed. Despite this, even as flawed creatures, we are capable of self-government. This was the founders' contention. As Madison says in another one of those Federalist papers, quote, "As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government small r Republican government, that is, representative government, presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Right? Republican government, in other words, in which the people rule, indirectly through their representatives, but nonetheless in which the people are sovereign ultimately, requires high things of them. Sometimes the founders are dismissed as individuals who believed that human beings were not capable of much. That in fact what was needed was a very controlling system that would keep the wealthy, the elite, the aristocrats in power. But in fact, when you look at it, as Madison contends in this Federalist, it took a lot of confidence in human beings, didn't it? Just enough confidence to say that we are capable of self-government. But you create government in such a way that human beings and their proclivities towards problematic behavior, towards greed, towards rapaciousness, towards even tyranny, that those tendencies can be controlled. But then the really tricky thing, the most difficult thing, is to make sure that the government that you set up can itself be controlled, right? Because the people who govern are no different than those who are governed. They're people. They are subject to the same nature as human beings. What's the alternative? The alternative is to believe that human beings are basically good, and that human nature is plastic, kind of like silly putty, able to be molded and shaped by the state or other forces. This is the progressive view, as we'll discuss later today. This view entails the possibility of perfection. It supposes that politics is the means for perfecting people. It dictates then that the state gets involved in that process of perfection. And it always fails. For human beings, while capable of self-government, are incapable of infinite malleability. It's those revolutionaries of the 20th century that supposed you could create a new Soviet man. Impervious to the idea of human nature, they believed that he could be molded any which way. And human beings broke. More than 100 million of them, souls extinguished in the course of the 20th century at the hands of communists. The American Revolution and the American revolutionaries' view of human nature is diametrically opposed to that view. The second principle, then, of the American founding is natural law. The Declaration of Independence appeals to the laws of nature and of nature's God to justify the American cause of independence. For those of you who are in studio, if you might have reference to your pocket Declaration and Constitution. Hillsdale College prints and makes these available to people. To date, I think we've given out over 1 million of them. The Declaration makes an argument that today Americans aren't quite as familiar with as we used to be. There are 4 references to the divine in the Declaration of Independence. 2 of them were inserted by Thomas Jefferson in his original draft, which he didn't think, by the way, needed any amendments. But amend it they did just a little bit. There were a couple of amendments added. That there were 2 more references to God added and a few other tweaks and things done to the Declaration of Independence. But the 33-year-old Jefferson had a brilliant draft and was a craftsman of the highest order. 4 references to God. Very briefly, let's go through them and ask what do they say. Well, that first reference is in the first paragraph. The first paragraph of the Declaration announces what the purpose of that document is. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The first reference to God, then, comes in that curious phrase, the laws of nature and of nature's God. The second reference, then, is to the Creator. It is from the Creator that human beings have rights. And that comes in the next sentence in the Declaration of Independence. The most famous, perhaps, of all of them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you have the laws of nature and of nature's God, and the Creator God. And if you drop back to the last paragraph, you find the other two references. God is referred to also as the supreme judge of the universe. The supreme judge of the universe. Right? And then the final reference in the Declaration of Independence is to divine providence. Now, the Declaration of Independence makes an argument. The argument comes in particular complaints against the king. It's saying of that king that he takes the legislative power, that he takes the executive power, that he takes the judicial power, and that he arrogates unto himself all three of those decisive powers. The Declaration of Independence indicts the king by saying, the prince has become a tyrant. The complaint is not just against King George III, though, really, because it's saying that no human being would be capable of holding all three of those powers. Only God, only the divine, could handle that kind of responsibility, right? And God wishes for us to be ruled not directly, not in a theocratic form of government, but rather in a new form of government. And that the American founding came to that realization that their republic ought to be based upon natural rights and upon natural law. So the Bill of Particulars, those complaints against the king, that long list in which they complain about various offenses against their liberties, is backed up by this kind of political theology, these references to God. Only God can handle that kind of responsibility. No human can. You can see in that, then, the rationale for the separation of powers. Right? Separate the powers so that no one branch of government has all of the authority. You know, natural law is something that is very often confusing to people because it would be supposed that you have to be of a particular faith or that you would have to even be a Christian to believe it. In fact, it's not the case. Natural law is available to human beings through reason. It's not a sort of a guide of here's what you should do in a particular case or circumstance, but natural law indicates simply that there is a foundation, a basis for moral right and moral wrong. Out of then those first two principles, the idea of human nature and natural law then comes the third, natural rights. Individuals are endowed by their Creator. Government does not grant the rights that exist because of our national condition as human beings. These natural rights are our most precious possession. Let me quote Alexander Hamilton. He said this at the time of the American founding. Quote, "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of divinity itself. They can never be erased or obscured by mortal power." That's the idea of inalienability, right? Life, liberty, property. Or in Jefferson's locution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, I remember as a kid seeing something that some of you may have seen actually on TV and others of you on DVD now, Schoolhouse Rock. Remember that? I'm just a Bill. I'm just an ordinary Bill. This was a means, rather a paltry one, at communicating civics lessons to Saturday morning cartoon watchers. Well, the one on the Declaration of Independence had, at the point when they're talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they showed a picture. It's a picture of obviously a patriot, an American patriot. And what he's doing is he's chasing after a woman, and she's running from him, and he's just not quite able to grab her. The pursuit, right? That's what they were trying to show. Now, that's a really strange idea, and it gets it just completely wrong, because the pursuit of happiness was not just do your own thing, do whatever you think is right, but actually it's synonymous with virtue. If you read Aristotle, and Jefferson says that when he came up with the Declaration of Independence, his inspiration was not something that he just conjured up, but rather it was Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, John Locke. If you read those individuals, those political philosophers, you see that to be happy is to be virtuous. To be virtuous is to be happy. You can't have happiness, in other words, simply by some hedonistic pursuit or some pursuit of money, but rather there has to be an ultimate end. It has to be directed, your pursuits as human beings have to be directed towards the right things. James Madison in Property said this. He wrote a little piece. It's in your reader, and it's an op-ed written in 1792. It bears the title simply of Property. As a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. In other words, we think of property as stuff, material possessions, but it's a lot more than that, in fact. For Madison, it is what we own, immaterially, our rights. Our most precious possession are our rights. The goal of good government is the protection of property. The fourth principle, then, is consent. Good government can rule only with the consent of the governed. As the Declaration tells us, we're citizens, not subjects. You know, it's sometimes thought that the break from Great Britain that America effected was not really that great, that we were just kind of continuing something rather than actually breaking away. And I would argue that, in fact, we were breaking away in one particularly decisive way, and that's the way that we understand rights. Under the Crown, one could enjoy a certain measure of religious liberty, but it was always understood more in terms of toleration, right? You're a subject. You're not a citizen that can assert, by right of your being a human being, a right to religious liberty. It's a very different conception of things. Because once you have a right by nature, that means that that's a right applicable anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are. Those are what we call today human rights. But perhaps a better way of thinking of them, because it points us back to the natural law, is natural rights. The consent of the governed is a pivotal principle for the American founders. It leads us then to an understanding of the fifth principle, limited government. This is an important one because I think in an era of political unrest, in an era in which we're trying to sort out as Americans what role should the government have in our lives, it's very important to recognize that the American founders did not believe that the federal government even should be weak, because it must be powerful, in fact, to do the things that it must do, those things that it's charged to do, particularly in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Government must be limited in purpose, then, but powerful in protecting people's rights. We don't want weak government, after all. That's one of the things that the founders, and Matt Spalding will address more of this in his presentation this morning. The founders were concerned because under the Articles of Confederation, there was a very weak government. There was no chief executive. There was no ability to tax at all. There was no court system to speak of that was a sort of independent judiciary. Right? These are all innovations of the Constitution. And Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, writing in the Federalist, and the other framers of the Constitution, knew that they had to avoid the example of many of the states, which themselves, like the federal government under the Articles of Confederation, were anemic. They were far too weak. I often ask my students, for those of them that grew up in small towns, they know that you can have a tyranny at the local level. Right? The American founding was very much about empowering states and also local communities. That's where self-government was going to be best lodged. But it also established a federal government that had particular purposes, and it had to be powerful in being able to execute those purposes. Right? We want a president who can operate with dispatch and energy. You need energy in the executive. Limited government, then, is the fifth principle. We'll wrap up very briefly with two more. Responsible constitutionalism. The government is responsible to the people, not for them. The government is responsible to the people, not for them. This takes us into those things that usually for most Americans are where the really boring part of civics begins, right? The separation of powers and federalism and checks and balances. What Publius called in the Federalist auxiliary precautions. But while most of our high school textbooks do a really lousy job of presenting those things, they're vitally important to maintaining Republican government. We talked a little bit about the rationale behind the separation of powers. Federalism, something that's almost entirely forgotten today, right? That understanding that it's not the federal government's role to do so many of the things that it does today. This all leads to the seventh principle, self-government. Self-government is the soul of good government. Americans, James Madison wrote, rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. And as George Washington said, quote, the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. An experiment. We think of experiment today in a very different way. You know, Washington, in his correspondence, which was voluminous, wrote very, very often about the millions yet unborn. We have a tendency to think very much in inevitability terms when we think of history, right? We know how the story ended. But for Washington, for Madison, and for the other framers of the Constitution, for the Founding Fathers, they didn't. They were uncertain, in fact, even as they signed that document on September 17, 1787, as they sent it off to the states, wondering if what they had crafted would even work, wondering, furthermore, would it be enacted, and wondering still more, what would future generations do with it? That's what they're thinking about when they think of experiment. As we'll see as the day goes on and in future sessions, as part of our Constitution Town Hall, the progressives had a very different understanding of experiment. For they thought of America as a very different thing. They saw the Declaration, for example, as outmoded. Kind of like if any of you had shown up today in a tri-corner hat, or came in and we were listening to fife and drum music, right? It seems out of place. I want to refer just to one more document, and then I'll look forward to taking any questions that you might have. Fast forward to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his 1944 State of the Union address. He refers to all of these documents that we've just looked at, the Declaration and the Constitution. He refers to the founding of America, and he said, at this time in our nation's history, in 1944, on the cusp of winning the war, but still mired in the Great Depression. Coming out of it a little bit, we'll hear a little bit more about that in our later sessions as well, but wondering, are the rights that are in our Constitution, are they enough? Do we need something more? Necessitous men are not free men, FDR said. And while the first Bill of Rights was okay for the framers in that time, we today need something different. We need something new. He said of those rights in the first Bill of Rights, they were our rights to life and liberty. The Wall Street Journal editors, the next day after FDR gave this speech, said, that's a curious use of the verb were. Don't you mean they are our rights to life and liberty? In other words, the first Bill of Rights is still fully in effect. Those natural rights don't go according to era. They don't come and go. That's the very idea of the fixity of human nature, the fixity of rights. Nothing from time to time changes whether or not they in fact exist. Governments even can come and go, and natural rights endure. FDR says what we need in addition then to that old outmoded notion of rights is a new one. And he lists a bunch of them. And they should be very familiar to our ears because they're part and parcel of our political discourse today. And in fact, they're part and parcel of a good chunk of the political platforms of really both parties, at least when you look to what has happened in effect over the last decade. The right to a job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to get a return on his products, free trade, the right of every family to have a home, the right to medical care, right? This is in 1944. The right to adequate protection from economic fears, the right to a good education. All of these spell security, FDR says. life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and security. He amends the Declaration of Independence, bringing it up to date. The question I put before students who take a course in Washington, D.C. as part of our Washington Hillsdale internship program is to compare Madison's piece on property and to stack up its argument for government's role with that of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's and the progressives. Which one presents a foundation that actually will support our edifice? Is there a tension there? It seems obvious, in fact, that there is a tension. Which foundation is more firm? I'll end there and invite your questions. Thank you very much for your attention. You can line up along the sides of the room here, and we'll start with a question from online. Our first question is from Jen in Spokane, Washington. I'll just read it here. It seems that the more handouts you give to people, the harder it is to take them away. I guess government handouts. How can we get back to this radical understanding of human nature, natural law, and limited government? We've just seen so many government programs with lasting consequences that it seems we'll never be able to fully be a nation of self-governing people. I feel like I sound cranky for saying this, but am I right? Well, it's a question that I think we're going to spend a lot of time reflecting on today. It's a question that, without punting completely to Dr. Arne in our fifth and final session, he's going to charge us with the question, okay, so we live in this thing that is sort of a legacy of the progressives, right? What you might call the administrative state, where you have government encroaching on every aspect of your life. A very different world from that of the founders. What do you do? What are your duties anymore? The rights don't change, but duties might. It is very hard to take handouts away from people. And it seems that what happened with FDR's Second Bill of Rights is that it was never formally proposed as part of our Constitution, right? None of those things are formally part of the Constitution of the United States. But they're part of our informal understanding, right? If you were to do this sort of political equivalent of jaywalking and ask people, let me read you a list of rights and you tell me whether they're in the Constitution or not, I fear that a lot of people would say of these rights, yes, they are. It's because a lot of our political leaders talk as if they are. In fact, what you see also is internationally, FDR's Bill of Rights is the basis for a lot of other countries' constitutions. If you print out, for example, the list of rights from the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights, it runs to, I think, some 20 pages. In Baghdad, at the largest university there, 70,000 students. Once they jettisoned the course on Ba'ath Party ideology, they had to figure out, well, what do we teach students now in its place? What they chose is to teach from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was formulated in 1948 as part of a United Nations conference. And as part of that formulation, they said, one thing that we're going to have to do in coming together to figure out a new conception of rights is forget about the question, where do they come from? That's off the table. That's a pretty big question, though, to leave off the table. So the question, to me, seems to be that if we're going to talk about all of these handouts and the kind of government programs that breed a kind of dependency rather than independence, that we have to go to the crux of the matter. And that's to talk about where do rights come from. If government can grant you a right, of course, it can also take it away. And the question is, if I have a right to a home, who has the right to pay for it? The problem comes, of course, in that, as has been chronicled by a number of individuals, some of them members of Congress, there reaches a certain point when people become so dependent that it's very difficult to take those things away, right? And that's the place we are now, I believe. Because it's not just corporate welfare, though that exists in huge quantities, sort of crony capitalism. And it's not just welfare for those who are poor. We spent $5 trillion on the war on poverty. But now the question is, for those that we call the middle class, are they going to give up their government goodies? That's the real question. We'll take a question now from our audience. Sir.
Yes. My question is, how did the courts allow the rights, so-called rights, that FDR propounded, how did they allow those to become, in effect, constitutional law to be supported by the redistribution of property as reflected in the Madisonian view? How did the courts allow this to come to pass?
Well, it's a good question. I think that you're right to point to the fact that a lot of this has been affected by a kind of judicial revolution, right? Judicial action. It's not something that you can point to just one or two court cases, but what you can see is an evolution that would say even more and more the idea of natural rights is completely irrelevant to our understanding of politics and political economy in America, right? So once, as a judge, if you take away the sort of natural rights framework, what are you left with? You're left with just then positive law. The legal training for most of our judges in this country and most of our attorneys shifted quite dramatically with the progressive era. What we came to do is we studied very different documents, very different thinkers. Rather than looking to the common law and to natural law thinkers, we began to look to different legal traditions. And we looked to especially some German thinkers who had a very different understanding of what a constitution ought to be. Woodrow Wilson, for example, gives us the idea of the living constitution, right? A living political constitution. He said that the founders were all really subject. The founders were all subject to an old understanding. They were Newtonian. What we have to be is Darwinian. And we have to understand that the law changes. It evolves. Things become different, right? So your legal framework changes quite dramatically, and then what happens quite quickly is that you have the ratification of these new ideas of rights. And really by dictate, by edict, the court says it shall simply be so. And then what do you have in future generations of law students? You have them reading court cases, right? Just court decisions after court decisions, without repairing to the standards and the fundamental principles, right? And if you just keep reading and stack up a bunch of court cases that start off on the wrong track, you're going to just be reinforcing bad principles. Paul Marino will talk about this more, and R.J. Pastrito as well. Let's go to a second audience question, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Lindai, and I'm originally from Honduras, and I'm Virginian by choice. And my question to you, Dr. Bobb, is, in your opinion, what causes the changes through time in the perception of these inalienable rights,
Yes.
And the permanent and consistency of human nature? Because I see what's going on right now, and there are so many people that don't think like us, that don't even, go back to the founding fathers, much less all, that you've talked about. Thank you.
Well, I think, it's remember after 9/11, all the signs that said united we stand? The question is really, what do we stand united on? What's going to allow us to be permanently one people and not divided into blue and red states? And I think that this is where these principles really come into play. Because it's not so much that you have to buy in if you're of a particular political persuasion, or that you're a member of a particular party, or that you're even a member of a particular religion or a particular denomination, right? What's really important is whether or not these principles are true. I think it's come to a place now in American civic education, and I see this having worked in schools across the country trying to revive these principles, that a lot of people think that this kind of an appeal to principles and old-fashioned ideas is simply an appeal to them because they're old, right? They're traditional. That's not a good enough reason, right? A lot of people raise this objection. I think it's a very good one, and it has to be handled up front. The founders talked a lot about equality. They held slaves. Most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, 2/3 of them, held slaves. How could that be possible? Well, we spend in our courses at Hillsdale and the programs that we run for teachers and in programs that we offer to citizens at large a lot of time grappling with that question. For we can certainly understand how a group of people would say of one thing, it is wrong, it is absolutely wrong, and we're going to give the rationale for its ultimate demise, but we're still going to continue to do it. That's an antinomy, a kind of contradiction that we can understand, however difficult it is to countenance it. The statue for Martin Luther King's memorial on the Mall has just had ground broken for. On that, it will emblazon a quotation he had about the Declaration of Independence, that was a promissory note, right? That it was something that was not just a promise, though, but it was a principle established. It was not a principle that the founders invented. They're saying, we are articulating this principle. This has been true for all times. What we are doing is basing a regime, a form of government, on that particular principle. So I think when you talk to your friends and neighbors about these principles, don't say, well, they're right just because a bunch of dead white guys believed it, right? The question is whether they're true today, whether they have always been true or not. What's the best explanation for government? What's the best foundation for government? You know, I think we so often, we've become so used to government solving so much that we think that it's going to be able to get us out of any quagmire, any problem, any challenge. We have come to believe that in an era in which the president will take somebody's name down and say that one of his aides will get on the problem that he or she is having, right? That kind of direct democratic action. We have come to a place where independent action, self-government, is increasingly difficult. So I think to wrest away from the administrative state, that mentality is going to take a long time. But it can be something as simple as just getting together with a group of your fellow citizens and reading through some of the documents. Take up a short opinion editorial like Madison's Property. And then write into your own newspapers. Hope that goes a little ways towards answering your very good question. By the way, for the rest of the story about the American founding and slavery, I'd highly recommend to you a book by Tom West called Vindicating the Founders. There's also some excellent information on Matt Spalding's website and also on the Kirby Center's website. You can find links to those things on the Hillsdale.edu web pages. We'll go to now we have time for an audience question. Go ahead, sir.
Good morning. My name is Howard Wooldridge. My question concerns privacy and property rights. Mm-hmm. Besides my good name, my most precious possession is my body. And for about 100 years now, there have been a group of Americans who've wanted to take away my possession of my body and make it more of the government's body as opposed to my own. And every day, I know my colleagues are going to go into thousands and thousands of homes and cars looking for certain substances, these prohibited drugs we have today. For those of us who would like to see a return to precious property rights and more privacy rights, mm-hmm. do you think that those individuals should seek perhaps a federal law which would strengthen the 10th Amendment, or perhaps go more to the state and either revise their constitutions or have some type of legislation which would, again, say, strengthen the privacy right, mm-hmm. so that the agents of the government would have a much, much tougher time coming into my home because the state is thinking I'm doing something that might hurt myself. As Jefferson said, I believe, better the problems involved with too much liberty as opposed to too little.
It's a question that raises a lot of different things, but one of them, and this is something that the founders certainly grappled with a lot, and that is, how do you make sure that liberty doesn't degenerate into license, right? You don't have the right to do anything you want. And in fact, the founders don't believe that you have the right to do anything you want, even in the confines of your own home, right? So then the question comes, what's the prudential line, right? How do we define and define rights and duties? And I think that the 10th Amendment is a thing that has been much neglected, the 9th Amendment as well. The Bill of Rights we often look to as the sort of main source of our rights. But in fact, it's not at all just the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is basically a structural thing. It says to the federal government, you shall not do this and you shall not do that. It is a restriction on their powers and their authority. The structure of the Constitution is the main thing. It's an edifice. That's what we teach in our Constitution course. It's really an architecture of liberty, right? Jefferson called it an empire of reason. It's a really important question, and I think that without getting into all of the different issues that one would have to raise with search and seizure or questions of drug legalization or even those sort of things, I think I'll just make this one note, that for the founders, virtue was a very important thing. You know, when you look to the question of individual and the community, you have to realize that actions that a single individual takes have ramifications for the community at large. No man is an island unto himself or herself. For the founders, local government was very important. And you know, at the time of the founding, there were a lot of very strict laws about what you could or could not even say, what you could or could not wear, including what you could or could not do in terms of actions. So I think that it's not clear at all that the founders would have been, for example, in favor of the decriminalization of drugs. It's a debate that certainly can be had. But there's something about the fact that we as a people have to perpetuate a republic. And you know, for the founders, this goes back to the idea of human nature. We're a combination of things, right? We have reason and we have passions. And those things, calm reason and roiling passions, are always in conflict. We see that a lot when we're working with students, right? The whole purpose of growing up is to allow the passions to be controlled more and more by your reason. Think of that on a grand cosmic scale. When you think of a nation of 300 million people, how do we govern ourselves? How do we keep a republic going if we let liberty degenerate into license? That's why virtue really does matter. You know, the Great Seal of the United States has at the base of it, and this goes to the uniquenesses of the American founding. The Great Seal of the United States has at its base, Novus Ordo Seclorum, new order of the ages. The United States really was something new. In the first 7 iterations of that Great Seal, the single word that was there was virtue. In choosing to have Novus Ordo Seclorum, they were not discarding the idea of virtue. It's written throughout the correspondence, throughout the documents. You can look to the Virginia Constitution and the Massachusetts Constitution, and it says that without certain virtues, and it names them, without a recurrence to certain fundamental principles, we will not survive. And when you're looking to public officials, you better see those certain virtues as well, right? Now, the Virginia and Massachusetts Constitutions were the models for a lot of others, including the United States Constitution. We have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up this session. Sir.
Frank from Forest, Virginia. In order to implement these principles and concepts that you're discussing with us today, I have a question. If a politician ran for national office openly rejecting FDR's second Bill of Rights, listing them, and embracing the original Bill of Rights, do you believe he or she is electable?
Absolutely. There's 33,000 people here today, right? There's a lot of people for whom the Constitution is not seen as just an advisory document. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. I've lived in Washington now just for 3 years. And before living there, I was in Michigan and lived in some other so-called blue areas. And you hear the term inside the Beltway. And you really don't know kind of what that mentality is in a way until you sort of live it. And you realize that the pulling out of the pocket copy of the Constitution is a political affectation for so many. They don't know it. They don't really care what's in there. It's an advisory document. It's a thing of technical detail, right? And it's not. The clauses of the Constitution are very important, but we shouldn't get hung up on only questions of that kind of technicality. They're very important. I don't mean to minimize the fact that, for example, when we have a piece of healthcare legislation, I think it does make sense to say it should be justified by the document, right? A justice of the Supreme Court in the state of Michigan told me that he had been canvassing various people on this very question. And he said, asking one person, so what's the justification for the particular pieces of legislation that are under consideration now? The response was the health clause. There isn't a health clause, right? What you have to do is begin to make politicians accountable in both parties. What is the constitutional rationale? Can you explain that? Can you, without reference to notes, and by the way, this is a teleprompter-free town hall, can you, without reference to notes, explain what's in the Constitution? Because this is the fundamental issue. Every one of those elected officials takes an oath, and that oath is to the Constitution. And what we have now is far too much of a kind of technocratic regime. And this holds true, I fear, for both and indeed a lot of other smaller parties, even that purport to have an understanding of the Constitution. You have to think about the whole thing and those principles broadly speaking.